Welcome to Block 23 of our Celebrating the States Block of the Month. This is our version of the Florida block. For this block, you will need 3 fabrics, a background, a medium, and a dark. From the background fabric, you need to cut 8 rectangles that are 2 3/4 inches by 5 inches. You will also need 4 squares that are 4.5 inches by 4.5 inches. You will also need 1 square that is 3 inches by 3 inches. If you wanted to, you could switch this fabric up to a different fabric because this square is the center of the block. From the medium fabric, you need to cut 8 squares that are 2.5 inches by 2.5 inches. From the dark fabric, you need to cut 4 squares that are 5 inches by 5 inches and 2 squares that are 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches. The 3.5 inch squares will be cut corner to corner to get 4 triangles. Unless directed otherwise, please use 1/4 inch seam allowances throughout the piecing of this block. With the right sides together, sew a dark triangle to opposite sides of the light 3-inch square. Center the triangle as best you can. It doesn't have to be perfect because we'll be trimming later. You can press with the iron or you can just finger press towards the 3-inch square. If this is the first state block you've seen, check the description below for a link to the playlist for all the other states we've done in this series. It's not too late to join in the fun. Repeat the process with the other 2 dark triangles and you will have a light square and a square with the dark triangles all the way around. Grab your scissors and trim off the excess fabric. Press the seams away from the center square. Trim this block to 4.5 inches square. All of the points for the center square should line up with the 2 1/4 inch markings on the ruler. Trim 2 sides, flip it over, and then trim the other 2 sides. With the wrong sides together, fold the dark square into a triangle and pin it to the light rectangle. You will pin the triangle to the right side of the rectangle. You will be making 4 of these units. Add the remaining rectangles with right sides together to sandwich the triangle between the 2 rectangles. You'll be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You'll be going through 4 layers of fabric, and yes, part of the triangle should stick out on the left side of the rectangle. It looks a bit silly, but this is the way it's supposed to look with the triangle kind of in between the 2 rectangles. Finger press it from the back side. You should be pressing the dark fabric so you'll have 2 layers of fabric on each side of that finger press. Now it's time to head to the ironing board. This next part is a little sneaky. You'll want to spread the triangle base out to lay flat against the edge of the rectangles. It should be centered. You should see the same amount of background on each side. You should have a crisp point at the top and a triangle will hang off the bottom. The point of the triangle at the bottom should line up with the seam between the rectangles. You want to press it flat. Use a little spray starch to help it hold its shape if you need it. I used a bamboo skewer to help me get the point nice and sharp at the top, but it all would work also. I first pressed them from the front, and then I flipped them all over and pressed them from the back side too, just to make sure they were going to be extra flat. Now that they're pressed, it's time to trim them down to 4.5 inches square. After a little testing, I found the easiest way to do this was to flip it over and trim it from the back side. I lined up the top of the block or the left side of the block with the 4.5 inch marking, and then I followed the seam line with the 2.25 inch marking. I trimmed 2 sides, I flip it around, and then I trim the other 2 sides. Just make sure you have a 1/4 inch seam allowance at the top where the point is. I saved the little bits that I cut off the bottom of that and just cut triangles for use in a future project. Next, we need to add the star points to this block. The easiest way to do this is to draw a line corner to corner on the wrong side of all the medium squares to have a line to sew on, or, if you prefer, use your diagonal seam tape as a guide. Before we add the star points, we do need to trim off some of the back seam to reduce bulk in the neck seams. I just cut a small triangle out of the bottom of the seam. Make sure you're only cutting through the back seam and not the triangle on the front. I also trimmed a little fabric from the seam itself. I skipped this step in one of my test blocks and soon discovered that it's much easier to sew the block if you do the trimming. Now that we have the excess fabric trimmed away, you're going to put a square on that bottom corner and then sew corner to corner right on that line or following your diagonal seam tape. You're going to do this for all 4 of the squares. Once you're done sewing these, you can trim the seam down to a 1/4 inch and then we'll do the other side. Or if you like to save a little bit of fabric here and there, I sew another seam a 1/2 inch away from the first one, cut in between, and then I have my 1/4 inch seam allowance, but I also have a square spare of a little something that I can use in a future project. You can head to the ironing board and press at this point, or if you want to skip it and wait till you get the other side done, I just did a quick little finger press to get me to the next step. Now we're going to do the same thing on the other side of this square with the remainder of the medium squares. Now it's time to press, and then we'll have all parts of our block ready to sew together into rows. You should have a 1/4 inch seam allowance available for you on both of these points, and this is the spot where it would have been bulky if we hadn't trimmed away the excess fabric. Now we'll take all the squares that we've sewn so far, plus the 4 light squares, and lay out our block arrangement. We're going to sew 3 rows that have 3 squares in each. When I get to this point, I usually open these up so that I can line up the last 3 blocks, make sure everything still looks correct, and then keep on sewing. Double checking that everything is okay is easier than getting the seam ripper out. Now it's time to press. We only have 2 seams left and our block will be done. We're going to press the top and bottom row towards the light squares, and we're going to press the center row towards the center square. I usually press these from the wrong side because it's a little easier to see what I'm doing. When you sew these rows together, the block should nest where these seams meet. It's time for one last pressing. While testing this, I discovered I had the best luck with these last 2 seams when I pressed them open. I did use spray starch to help me get the seams to lay really flat. When you finish pressing from the back, turn it over to make sure the front is nice and flat. Make sure the 3D parts of the block look correct. I left the triangles loose, but you can top stitch them down if you prefer that. At this point, the block should measure 12.5 inches by 12.5 inches. It will finish 12 inch by 12 inch in the quilt top. Here's my test block made with a little bit softer of a blue for the dark. And what did I do with all those little pieces I cut off, those corners? I made these cute, adorable little 3-inch blocks, of course. I'm not sure what I'll use them for, but I'm sure I'll think of something. We hope you'll remember to hit the like button, leave us a comment, share the video with your quilting friends, and subscribe so that you can see all of our future videos for celebrating the States. Thanks for watching and happy quilting!